Alexandra Davis is the managing editor at Public Discourse, which, if you don't read it, you should. It's really one of the finest Catholic online publications out there. And I don't say that only because I write there occasionally, but because it really is an amazing publication. Then we have Daniel Hart. So Dan Hart is a current GCP fellow and is a partner at Seyfarth Law. So he's our big law representative on this panel. And then John Ketcham is the director of cities at the Manhattan Institute and does a number of legal, quasi-legal, and policy functions there at Manhattan Institute. So the purpose of this panel today, most of what we do at GCP Fellowship is to help serious faith-based lawyers to live their vocations from God more fully, but with the unique focus on what that means in the context of being lawyers. A lot of us are married. We all have very busy professional and personal lives. And so how do we manage from the perspective of being lawyers to live out our vocations and to become saints? So the idea of this panel was to bring together people who use their law degrees in very different ways and to get some different perspectives on how that plays out in their own vocational lives. So good, I kept my intro notes under 5 minutes. With that, I'm going to turn it over. So Alex, if I could start with you, you're chosen for this panel for a couple of reasons. For one, because you have a JD and are a lawyer who doesn't really practice law anymore. And also you've done quite a bit of work in helping lawyers to use their JDs for things other than the practice of law. So I'll just turn it over to you. Tell us about your vocation and how your legal training has aided you in that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Frank. I'm very honored to be here and speaking to all of you today. I'll say really three things as a lawyer who no longer practices law actively but maintains an active bar license in the state of North Carolina. I have gone from a very traditional legal practice straight out of law school, primarily construction litigation, fiduciary litigation, and fraud claims. I did that for 2 years and then transitioned into sort of a quasi-legal role. I started a small business providing ghostwriting services for lawyers and academics in the legal industry. And now I've sort of sidestepped my way into a very much JD adjacent role as the managing editor of Public Discourse. That being said, though I am sort of a self-proclaimed evangelist for the non-traditional JD career, I very strongly believe that once you are a lawyer, you are always a lawyer. And let me share three ways that I think that my legal training and legal practice experience, though it was brief, have really shaped me in my vocation. For context, I am a mother. I have three very young children, also work full-time as the managing editor of Public Discourse remotely from Raleigh, North Carolina. One, I would say the legal field has a very high bar to entry. Like doctors, there's a lot of moral, ethical, and legal strictures that sort of constrain our work. And these are good things, right? These standards keep us operating at the highest level, personally and professionally. What we do in our personal lives reflects back upon our professional lives and vice versa. There are very few professions for which this is true. So because of that, I believe that once you've worked as an attorney, you develop an elevated set of standards for how you conduct yourself. And it is impossible not to carry those into everything you do. I think that even having practiced law for a brief amount of time, I will truly never be the same in the way I look at my professional work, even though I am no longer practicing. Second, I would say that the law is a profession that hinges almost entirely on the needs of others, and quite often very pressing needs, sometimes even truly life and death. And professionally, it really parallels the outpouring of our time and energy that our vocations require. I never would have thought that law school and legal practice would have prepared me for life in the trenches with back-to-back babies, but somehow it really did. And finally, I would say the intrinsic flexibility of the JD in unique ways really forces constant discernment in different life stages. So there are many things that can be done with a law degree: full-time work, part-time work, litigation, transactional work, academia, work inside or outside of the courtroom, et cetera. And with this just plethora of options before us, our degree really lends itself to sort of shaping and molding our careers according to the unique needs of our families or our other vocations. And because of that, we're sort of, our feet are sort of held to the fire. We constantly have to step back and reevaluate, is my work currently contributing to the flourishing of myself and everyone else under my care? Or is a change necessary? And I think that that's unique. That's certainly not true of every profession. And I think that that is something that is very, very good for us when it comes to habit formation, when it comes to practicing our discernment skills. It's something that lawyers uniquely are both privileged and challenged with.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to you on a couple of these things, but yeah, Dan. So let's move to a very different perspective. From someone who has not used her JD in like the traditional legal practice sense to you, who are a partner in a rather large firm. So I'd love to hear your perspective on your vocation and the benefits, challenges of working in that particular area of like large firm private practice life.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. And it's a real pleasure to be here today. Uh, I've been practicing 21 years now, and every year of practicing has been at a big firm. I would like to say that when I started my legal career, I joined a big firm because it was a product of very intense, prayerful discernment. But like a lot of lawyers, it really came down to practical necessity. I had loans to pay off and a growing family to support. But I am a big believer in flowering where God has planted you. And over the years, it became clear to me, more clear, that God had planted me in the world of big law for a reason. And there's a lot I could say about the vocation of a lawyer, but today, one aspect I want to focus on is my vocation as a litigator. I'm an employment lawyer, so I represent or provide advice to companies in employment issues. And I also litigate disputes that arise out of the employment relationship, or more often the termination of the employment relationship. And among the kinds of cases I handle are a number of discrimination and harassment cases. Now, as you can imagine, those cases sometimes involve some fairly tawdry allegations. They also typically involve a fair amount of discovery into extremely personal information about the people involved. Most plaintiffs who are alleging workplace discrimination seek damages for alleged emotional distress. And for that reason, it's fair, as the employer's counsel, to do a deep dive into the plaintiff's psychological history, to understand what other life events have caused trauma apart from the workplace. Very often that involves a pretty raw look at brokenness in our sinful world. The often very sad stories of broken families, substance abuse, childhood trauma, mental health challenges, sometimes sexual abuse. Some years ago, probably about a decade ago, I started to experience some burnout in handling these sorts of cases. I asked myself, is what I'm doing really making any difference? Family and friends said, of course it is. I mean, think about the managers or the business owners who have been accused of discrimination and they didn't do anything wrong. I mean, you're making a big difference in their lives. Think about the associates that you're mentoring in your practice. You're making a big difference to them. And I knew that was true. And yet the constant challenge of litigation, particularly these kind of cases, was starting to get to me. At this time, I was handling a case involving a plaintiff with an extremely troubling psychological history. The plaintiff's name was Bobby. That's not his real name. I'm using a pseudonym for his anonymity. The facts of the case are not important, other than that Bobby was suing his former employer, which happened to be my client in the case. And his claims struck me as fairly bogus, and I have to say the court agreed and ultimately granted summary judgment to my client. But what's relevant here is that Bobby's psychological history was a major focus of discovery in the case. And by looking at psychological records, I had a really privileged look into this person's background. Bobby suffered from gender dysphoria, and he had a really long history of depression and anxiety for which he had sought treatment from various therapists over the course of about 2 decades. And it seemed to me, in looking at the psychological notes, that the therapist, for the most part, simply prescribed antidepressants as treatment. Nothing wrong with that. But it didn't seem to me that there was any treatment for really the underlying traumas in his life. And one of the notes from his therapist that I had to review in discovery really revealed the depth of the brokenness that Bobby had experienced in his life. Bobby had shared with the therapist that he had been sexually abused by an uncle at the age of 3. And he had gone through years of shame and confusion as a result of that truly evil act that had been inflicted on him. And then my eyes really, or my ears perked up when I saw in the notes that he shared with the therapist that in the evening, he would be visited by a being that can only be described as demonic, who would tell him over and over again, "You're garbage, you're nothing, you're worthless, you can never be loved." And as you can imagine, this was difficult to read. I shared with a family member that I was having a hard time in this case, coming face to face with such brokenness and sinfulness in the world. And I really wished I didn't have to handle this case. And she very wisely said to me, "God put you in a position to be handling this case for a reason. You might be the only person in the world who is privileged with knowing this information about this person, who also knows that he is someone in need of prayer." And I realized she was right. And from that moment, I saw Bobby not as just another plaintiff to beat in litigation, but as a beloved child of God who desperately needed the healing that only God can provide. Now, that doesn't mean, and I resolved to pray for Bobby, and I've done that ever since, even 10 years after the case is over. That doesn't mean that I thought his legal claims had any merit. It doesn't mean that I hesitated for a minute in defending my client against the claims that he brought. But it did impact the way I viewed him and the way I viewed my vocation as a lawyer. And I hope that it impacts the way that I treat all people in litigation as beloved sons and daughters of God who may have business interests that diverge from those of my client, but nonetheless have intrinsic dignity as sons and daughters of God. Now, one Sunday around the same time, I was at Mass, and the reading that day was from Matthew 16, where Jesus says, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." Now, I'd always thought of that passage as saying essentially, hell is not going to defeat the church. But the celebrant, Father Ray Panetta, pointed out, in ancient cities, walls are built around the city to protect against invading armies. In that image, it's not hell invading the church, but the church that's invading hell, and the gates of hell will not prevail. And I can't recall Father Ray's exact words, but his homily seemed to speak directly to me. And he said something like, "Go to the places that are hell, the places of God-forsakenness, the places of brokenness. Invade those places with the love of Jesus Christ, and the gates of hell will not prevail." So after Mass, I thanked Father Ray for his homily. I think I told him it's the first time I ever heard a priest tell everyone to go to hell. But his words stuck with me, and I thought immediately of Bobby. And I thought of the hundreds of people like Bobby, whom God has put in my path because I have been the lawyer on the other side of litigation against those folks. As an employment lawyer, my practice has given me access to places of real profound brokenness and real profound places of God-forsakenness. Having the vocation of a lawyer means a lot of things, but at a minimum, I think it means seeking the sanctity of the world, one person at a time. And for me, that means striving to see every person as God sees them, even if, in this case, as in so many cases, they are on the other side of the litigation for my client and me.
Wow, thank you, Dan. I want to come back to how we cultivate that, but I think that's so profound, especially because if you reflect on like Bobby or probably dozens of other people that we come across in our various professional lives in such a secular, broken world, you may encounter people where there's literally nobody in their life who's praying for them or who thinks
Mhm.
of them at all. So you may very well be the only person, right, living a life of grace who can really make such an impact, even just by praying, even if there's no contact otherwise, right? So thank you so much for that, and I'm gonna circle back to that in a few minutes. Now let's John, let's turn to you. So we had the non-practicing lawyer and the very much practicing lawyer, and I think you're something of a hybrid. So I know you do legal work. I think you signed the amicus brief that went in the Scrimetti case to the Supreme Court this past term, isn't that right? For
Yes,
Manhattan Institute.
we do an amicus program led by Ilya Shapiro at the Manhattan Institute, and one of the areas in which I assist is pediatric gender medicine, warning the court about the dangers that it poses to children who go on to persist in their gender dysphoric feelings if they're affirmed in that behavior, and then uh, go on oftentimes to medical treatments like puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, which carry very much known and anticipated risks, including long-term risks.
Yeah, so on that side, you do very much legal practice, but I know you're also involved in a lot of very fascinating areas of city policy and writing where that are not the practice of law in the strict sense. So tell us maybe in your hybrid professional experience how you find that your legal training and your work plays into your vocation.
Sure. Thank you, Frank. And thank you to Napa Legal. I'm delighted to be with all of you today. And a big congrats to Mark as he takes on this new role. So, since I was young, I always was inspired by the idea of servant leadership. That if a leader really wanted to emulate Christ, he would sacrifice his ego for the needs of others, as Alex said. And in doing so, find that he puts on Christ and he puts away the old man, like St. Paul tells us. One of the most wonderful titles in the world is the Pope's title of Servus Servorum Dei, the servants of the servants of God, the servant of the servants of God. Um, and for me, the path to holiness necessarily runs through action and through service. I'm a New Yorker. I'm a doer. I struggle with the virtue of patience, and I find nothing more satisfying than working towards and accomplishing goals. Um, and I'm always inspired by the philosophy, the great tradition, and I'm knowing like why am I doing what I'm doing? It's not good enough for me just to keep going on because I've done so in the past. I need to know why. And I always think back to Tocqueville when I think about lawyers, about community, about the common good. Tocqueville wrote that lawyers are defenders of the public order. And I think he was quite right about that. We're naturally oriented towards putting things in their right place. Categorizing situations into one type or another type is basically at the heart of a lawyer's job, no matter whether it's in transactional work or litigation or government work. And because we lawyers are trained in governance, in the art of directing, activities and people in a certain way, I think that makes us a natural fit to lead institutions like civic associations, school boards, charities. Um, so, in building and shaping these institutions, we help our neighbors to develop attachments and affections to their home and their communities. And in my role at the Manhattan Institute, I try to do that through good public policy. So, good public policy can allow for societal flourishing by creating the conditions that allow people to be their best selves, right? So, public order and safety are essential foundations for any well-ordered society. Um, you need to be able to walk down the street without the fear of being assaulted if you want to um, you know, be at your best self, right? If you're constantly paralyzed by fear, that's not going to be good for you or for your contributions to a society. The Manhattan Institute has been central to the idea of policing and public safety, to building up strong communities based on uh, good trust between police and community, but fundamentally around the police's role in shaping uh, people's perceptions of safety, in making sure that there are like people around that can actually handle difficult situations. And uh, we've seen over the past 3 decades that police-based public safety works. Over the 1990s, 2000s, aughts, it simply worked to produce miraculous declines in the murder rate and in serious index crimes across the board. So that's just one area where my work intersects with building the common good. I also work on things like housing policy, and local elections policy. How do we structure elections to allow for majority rule while also giving minority groups in a particular jurisdiction the sense that they should come back and try again if they lose, right? Like that the political game is worth playing and continuing on. Um, and I do this out of a love of home. Like I said, a native New Yorker. I was really blessed to grow up in a strong community that was getting better, safer, more prosperous every single year. And I feel it's incumbent upon me to perpetuate that into the future. And I do so in my work for the Manhattan Institute, but also in my community life. And servant leadership could be rendered in a lot of different ways. So we can do so near our homes and far from our homes. And I love that the church has this dual nature. It creates durable institutions in each place, and yet it also commands us to spread the gospel to all the corners of the world, right? To convert the world in missionary zeal. So we have to staff and man the fort while we're, in our homes, but we also have to reach out to the universal and fill it with this agapic love. Now, I'm firmly in the former camp of manning the fort in my hometown of Astoria, Queens, and I fulfill a lot of different local roles. So I'm the treasurer of the Catholic school that I attended as a youngster. I lead a lawyers club in the area that's been around for about 90 years now. I'm on the board of 2 Italian American clubs, and these clubs are for people from my family's hometown in Italy. So there's a nice sense of continuity there. I feel like these roles have really helped me to grow in virtue, like patience and fortitude. Um, all of this is volunteer. So virtue is its own reward and its only reward. Uh, the the Catholic Church, I like to joke, will always find some things for you to do, provided you're willing to do it for free. And but it's really been a great blessing to be invited to participate as a good steward in my community, in the place that I love, and the place that I want to foster the same kinds of attachments and affections in the young today. Um, but the church is also the most important institution in civil society as well, right? Tocqueville called religion the first of America's institutions. And it's through the church that we also develop these affections and attachments, first for our community and then outwardly, ultimately embracing the whole of humanity in Christ's agapic love. Um, and I feel that integrating my life in this way, um, through practice of law, through policy, through my work in being an activist in the Manhattan Institute for good, pragmatic public policies that foster the common good, they help me to live in the way that the book of Micah describes, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. Um, and so I'm really blessed to live this integrated life and to render service to my community and to the church. And I like to say that I hope that everyone has a place where they feel that they can belong, a place where they can call their own, because it has just been such an immense joy in my life um, to be part of something much bigger than myself, in which I can sacrifice myself in little ways mostly, but in ways that I feel perpetuate the continuity of a good society and of flourishing in that society. So. Um, uh, I hope that all of you watching can have that same sense of rootedness and connectedness that I've been so blessed to have. But it's out there, and it's just a matter of finding it and enmeshing yourself in that community and doing the good work every day of building up the kingdom of God on earth.
Wow. Thank you. You all have given more than enough material to start asking some follow-up questions, but I also wonder if you were a typical sampling of lawyers, because I had planned on each of you giving 7 to 10 minutes of remarks, and you actually stayed within the time window. So that's extremely unusual and surprising. All right, so we have some time for follow-ups. Um, you know, I have a lot that I want to try to get to here, but I guess the first, because this is one of the most common questions that I encounter among GCP fellows, is kind of a not a vocational crisis, but a question of should I be doing something different, right? Often it's people who are in like bigger law firms and are burning out, or they just kind of don't like the job, or they're considering more mission aligned work, but they don't know if they can feed their family doing it. So I guess I'll just kind of leave it open. Maybe if each of you want to give any thoughts, Alex, Dan, John, about how do you go about this question of am I really in the wrong place and I should be looking at a job switch, or do I maybe need to just embrace where I am? Yeah, how would you approach that?
I'd like to point to what both Dan and John said about this. Both of you referenced it in different ways, but this idea of rootedness and flourishing and sort of this continuity of life. You know, as lawyers, we're really privileged in that there is a lot of continuity between our professional vocations and our personal ones. I want to go back to this Tocqueville quote. We love Tocqueville at Public Discourse, but the idea that lawyers are defenders of the public order. That takes a lot of different forms throughout our lives, from sort of stewarding of local institutions to maybe doing something like what we do at Public Discourse, where we take that and sort of universalize it, and we sort of bring these certain views to the public. We help the public shape their perceptions of different cultural issues. Maybe it's within your family, maybe it's within the the religious order in which you work, you live and work, or and I think that I think about this quote that just came to my mind from A.G. Sertalange, the French priest who wrote that very popular little red book, The Intellectual Life. And he had a quote, and I'm going to butcher it. I don't have it in front of me at the moment, but something about how truth is truth, but it has in a different ring on each of its individual instruments, and its instruments being us. So not all attorneys are meant to pursue public order in the same way. We all bring very different, unique gifts to the table. Dan, you said that so well when you said, what if I am the only person who's uniquely suited to receive this person's story and pray for this person and love this person without even having contact with him? We all have that opportunity. And I think that when it comes to discerning a job change, where our culture does us a massive disservice is convincing us that it's all about our desires, disconnected from a greater good, a common good, the flourishing of society, the flourishing of our families, which are, as one of my colleagues put it so well, their own entities with their own needs. I think that this is very impoverishing to young professionals who are trying to figure out what they are meant to do. And I think that there is a lot to be said for pressing on in a situation that feels very uncomfortable. I think that there's a lot to be said for the dignity of doing a job that maybe isn't absolutely lighting your soul on fire every single day, if you have in fact discerned that it is what not only goes to your flourishing, but is how you allow that sort of individual ring of truth to go out to the community. So I think thinking about it in connection with the people, the institutions, the communities with which we are intimately connected. And I think the way to start there is to go embed yourself in the local community, to sort of lose yourself in these opportunities to serve and to love. And then I think from there, what you're meant to do professionally will sort of make itself evident, much more so than if you go off into the woods by yourself for 5 days with your journal and just try to figure out what it is you're meant to do.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly, Alex. That was beautiful. We have this misconception in society that happiness is the absence of any kind of obligation. But I think real happiness is a sense of being needed in, tangible ways and of contributing your best self to that need, and in doing so, growing um, as part of a community and then also individually. So sometimes we've put so much stock in the career aspect of our lives that we don't quite notice that there may be other things missing. And as Alex said, if we fill some of those other things up, that might give us clarity on what we really are missing. Maybe you conclude at the end of that that you should go and change a career or change a practice. That's fine, but at least you've done like the work to see, is it really my career that is making me dissatisfied, or the particular practice area that I'm in, or is it something a little bit deeper, more fundamental? And yeah, it's not about getting rid of our obligations. It's about finding meaningful ones that draw us closer to Christ, ultimately to his teachings and to one another, and to greater encounters of love in our communities. And I think that that is something lacking largely in local America. And it's up to all of us as local leaders, as attorneys, as these natural leaders that Tocqueville mentions, to do our part in building up this American civilization. I love the idea of lawyers as builders of something great. And we can all do that as part of this civilization building mission that's also at the heart of the church.
Yeah, I'd echo all of that, and I would add just a couple other comments. I think these are intensely individual decisions or discernments that need to take place through spiritual direction, through priests, through family, loved ones. Um, and we pray in the Our Father, give us this day our daily bread. Sometimes God's just calling any of us to be where we are right now. And there's this this interesting combination that we have in our faith of both being focused on where we're put and rooted and all in, and at the same time having that holy sense of detachment. So, God, this is where you're putting me now. I have faith in that. But if you call me somewhere else, I am open to that. I love the ministry of the witness that a lot of the missionary orders have, where every year the sisters or the brothers will pack their bags in case their provincial superior sends her elsewhere. And I've heard stories about sisters in Mother Teresa's order who, are 80 years old and have been at the same location for 30 years. And every year they pack up their suitcase and they're ready to go just in case they're called elsewhere. And I think for those who are lay people practicing law, a similar attitude is a holy one. We're going to be fully invested where we are, but not so committed to where we are that we're not listening to the voice of God calling us elsewhere.
These were all really great answers. I want to just take the moderator's privilege of adding a thought here, because I think it's helpful in the whole understanding of discerning where one is called, right? From from the traditional Catholic understanding of vocation, but I think our non-Catholic participants will resonate with this as well, right? The primary sense in which one is called to a vocation, what we're talking about is a state of life, right? So for Catholics, that's priesthood or religious life, right? The vows, and or if not, then for most people, it's married life, right? So your vocation for a layperson is generally that of marriage and family. And so when we talk about vocation within the law or vocation within our professional lives, that's still meaningful, right? God calls us to things, but I think it's important to put these in their proper order, that when we're talking about my vocation within the law, we are talking about it in a kind of secondary sense, that it's subservient to our state in life. So for married folks, especially, your professional choices have to be subservient to your obligations as spouse and as parent. And I think that's a really helpful lens through which to look at like crises in discerning your job changes, or do I stay, do I go? Because I've seen it on both sides, right? I think on one hand, you can have this kind of temptation toward mission-driven life, right? Like I really, and I was a seminarian and I was in the monastery for a couple of years. So especially among ex-seminarians, you see this kind of unintentional clericalism where they're like, well, if I'm not going to be a priest, I need to do something that looks like priest-ish. They don't say it like that, but they want to go be, religion teachers or youth ministers, but they also want to get married, and they're going to probably have children, and you can't raise children on a job that doesn't provide a living wage, right? Which a lot of these don't. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. You shouldn't be miserable, but your primary goal in your professional life is first of all to support your family. And so on the flip side of that, though, I think when you do want to ask these questions is maybe not like, is my profession right now or my job right now mission driven enough, but is it amenable to family life, right? Because especially if you have little kids and you're at a particularly demanding firm where you're literally losing, nights, you're missing dinners, you're missing weekends, to the point where it's actually, your spouse is having a hard time with it, your kids are suffering, then we're actually talking about primary vocational impact, right? So I obviously, like Dan said, this is very individual and needs to be discerned with loved ones and spiritual directors. But I think it's always helpful to reframe that for the married lawyer, especially those with younger children. But your job is not your primary calling, and so putting these things in proper order, I think, will really help give you insights on how to think about things like job changes. All right. Couple other follow-ups on what we talked about. So I think, first of all, maybe Dan, if you have thoughts too, but particularly John and Alex, because you're in kind of not traditional law firm practice of law jobs. Do you touched on it a little bit, but any particular insights on how the JD, how the legal education and legal background has helped you professionally where you find yourself? Maybe Alex, if you want to take it first.
I'll speak specifically to my position, but then more generally. So specifically for my position, one of the biggest parts of my job is helping people sharpen their arguments. Law school, if nothing else, teaches us how to make a great argument, how to look for gaps in arguments, how to look for bad ones and to create better ones. And I do think that it has helped me as a lawyer, or being a lawyer has helped me be a better editor. More generally, though, which is hopefully more applicable to others, is I think that law school, it's very demanding, and uniquely demanding. And so is legal practice. And I think that having gone through that, it really increases your capacity to do difficult things in the professional world. I think that having, been a part of some difficult, sticky, sort of harrowing cases has made challenges in my work now feel a lot more manageable than if I had just taken this job when I was 22 and right out of college. I also think that lawyers do bring a unique sense of professionalism to a lot of their work that is very attractive to different employers. So those are sort of broad points, and I'm certainly happy to discuss this in more detail with any people who are particularly interested in maybe a JD adjacent role.
So I deal with laws all the time, even as I don't write briefs or write contracts or anything like that. Um, Law is the vehicle by which policy gets implemented, right? And if you are constantly dealing with policy, well, you want to know how that the implementation works so that you can see how people's incentives are going to be structured, whether there are any loopholes to get out of the law and then the policy, like does the exception swallow the rule and so forth. Um, I also do quite a bit of model legislation drafting, and I think that is something that law schools should focus more on. It's quite absent from most legal education. So you'll write a brief and you'll write a memo as if you were a clerk. At least that's how my legal writing class went. I think that's pretty typical. But oftentimes you can go through the entire 3 years of law school without drafting a law or uh, even having to, like put together a contract or a brief, unless you do some clinic or something like that. But it really is important training because you get to see like how difficult it is often to write something that's going to capture just what you want to capture, not more, and not leave out what you mean to include, like in loopholes, for example. So it really is quite the art to craft something like that. And I find that model legislation is very effective at furthering policy goals because it shows how lawmakers can implement something with relative ease. And one thing I recently did in this front was banning smartphones in K to 12 public schools across the country, right? It's something that is an anodyne issue. It's a 70-30 or 80-20 issue, but you'd be surprised at how much pushback you get again from this for reasonable rationales for things like parents wanting to get in touch with their kids in the event of an emergency, right? So how do you craft a model bill that bans the worst practices, but also allows parents to feel comfortable enough and confident enough that they can get behind it, right? And that's an exercise in prudence just as much as it is an exercise in legal drafting. And I'm sure that Daniel has a lot of experience in the drafting aspects of it, and I think it's very important for us to be good writers as attorneys.
Yeah, it's funny, John. You made me think of a conversation I had a few months ago with a parishioner from my parish who had said I was just annoyed about, something stupid that had happened in Congress and just throughout this argument, it's like, one of the big problems, we just have too many lawyers in Congress. Thought that's I thought the answer to that is obvious, right? You should understand how law works if your job is to write law. But I think that's a really good point for individual vocation, John, that for maybe people who are, working in private practice or and looking for something kind of service oriented that I mean, good, thoughtful, faithful lawyers working in local government or state legislatures, things like that. It's incredibly helpful to have thoughtful people who actually understand how the law works to be, in the lawmaking body of government. Um,
Yeah, out of
Dan,
the
sorry.
56 signers of the Declaration, 25 were lawyers and 10 others had legal training. So maybe that's where it went wrong. There's just too many lawyers way back when.
Yeah,
We did okay, all things
that's
considered.
right. Um, Dan, do you have any other thoughts on this, or should I ask you my next question?
Yeah, go on to the next one since I think Alex and John were really the experts on that topic.
All right, so what I want to follow up on you talking about this unique opportunity in one's professional life to see a child of God instead of an annoying client or annoying opposing party or whatever it is. So I guess the question is it's easy to conceptualize that, right? You wake up, you have a nice disciplined morning, you pray, you're fired up for the day. I'm gonna, live in the presence of God and focus on my, the way that I'm supposed to live this holy life. And then you hit the office door and you just forget about it for right the rest of the day. And then sometime around 4 o'clock, you remember that you haven't thought about God or the human dignity of anybody for the last 7 hours. So any thoughts on that, or how one can actually cultivate that practice in day-to-day life?
I think it's a good practice for litigators before you send off the nastygram to think about it first, and that's just good lawyering, right? I mean, if you're dealing with a particularly obstreperous opposing lawyer, maybe you don't need to respond to the nasty email the same day. Maybe you sit on it the next day. And I think there's a tendency in litigation where, we think we need to respond immediately. And I'm not sure that's always the best practice for litigators or lawyers in general. We should be able to take some of the emotion out. But if you're looking at it from the eyes of faith, it also gives you a chance to sort of assess the situation. You can zealously advocate for your client and do so dispassionately, and really treat the opposing lawyer, and I'm using opposing lawyer here, but it could be anybody who is very difficult, in a way that is respectful of their dignity and is also honoring of your dignity as a person. And so I don't have any great insights other than just, take a breath sometimes and wait before you respond. I also think it's helpful just to be deeply embedded in prayer. I am not great at this, but I know some lawyers who will start every day with a prayer. I know one lawyer who has on his calendar at noon, he's going to, pray the Angelus, which is great. And I think if you can find a way to work into your day just reminders of why you're there, it makes it a little bit easier to deal with these other situations that arise with the appropriate response.
Alex or John, anything to add?
I'll just say that sometimes it could be challenging to deal with policy problems, and always remembering that these are people we're dealing with, right? That they're not problems to solve, but they're people to save, and that we should always remember that they're made in the image and likeness of God, and that we are commanded by our Lord and Savior to love them as we love ourselves. It's a constant challenge because as a lawyer, you're naturally a problem solver, right, for your client. And as someone working in policy, you're trying to solve a vexing issue on behalf of the public good, right? But I think of an example like the migrant crisis, where that's really tough. We have tens of thousands of people coming here claiming asylum. They want a shelter bed. The law requires them to have a shelter bed in New York City on demand immediately. It's the most generous in the country. So you're balancing the needs of a acute population in who are probably temporary and transient, at least to some degree, with the common good of the residents of a place, right? And dealing in a world of limited resources, right? Um, what got lost in that mix often was the the imperative to be generous hosts and just to the stranger, to people who are in need, in part because we just defaulted to the law. We just looked at the law as this is what's in place and we have to follow it, more as a duty of the law rather than as something that we give in love. And I advocated for changing the law because it was based on a consent decree from now 44 years ago, which I think is unreasonable to apply, to a completely different situation that involves up to 70,000 migrants at one point, in an application that really was never meant to handle. But at the same time, legislation should be crafted with the idea of caring for the neediest and of making sure that our public resources go to the most needy. And that's also another perennial challenge, whether public resources should go to those most in need or to a broader array of people who perhaps aren't quite in such dire need.
Yeah, I mean, this is a whole separate discussion, but I think particularly the migrant crisis one is a really important one to keep in mind, that as we're working through, right, the legal processes, or the policy, right, how do we practically allocate resources within reason and deal with these problems? There's there's a real need for, resource allocation and national security and local crime issues, but I always fear that on one hand, you have kind of the bleeding heart desire to give and give in a way that is not prudent for the common good. But then on the other end of the spectrum, for people to get all in on, like, there's a migrant crisis, close the border, sure, but then to kind of the danger of losing the human dignity of the actual people that you're talking about. You may still have to take drastic policy actions, but always so important to keep right, the human dignity of each person in front of you as you're working through these, right, political or policy decisions. Um, I I know we're about to come up on time. Um, there's one more question in the queue I want to try to get to. I know we're not going to get to everything, but somebody asked, it's kind of a follow-up on the whole vocational discernment question, but this attendee asks, can you talk about how to reconcile our desire to take on legal matters, for example, defending anti-abortion laws that may close doors to future career opportunities, for example, at large law firms, with our responsibilities toward our family? And I know that's a litigation question, but it would apply just as much, right, Alex, if somebody who's got a private, quiet, professional life and then has an idea like, do I publish this essay on transgenderism or abort? Because all of a sudden, then you are out there, right? So, any insights from any of you on how we kind of handle those questions of whether to cross the line?
I guess I would echo what I said earlier, or repeat what I said earlier, of this is going to be a very individualized discernment process. And, I think the church in her wisdom on something like this leaves a lot of room for the exercise of conscience. And so, there's no requirement necessarily to take one path versus another, but I would say if you're thinking about that, pray. It's probably if you have a family, that's a decision that your spouse needs to be involved in. That's not your own decision. And if after talking with your spouse and talking with spiritual director, if you have one, you feel strongly that that's what God's calling you to do, you know, don't turn back, don't look back, and go forward, knowing that you have discerned. But if it doesn't seem like it's the right decision for you, based on very prayerful reflection, then don't go that path. I don't know what else to say other than that it's going to be a very individualized assessment.
On my theme of building institutions, I think this is why we need good lawyers like Daniel and Alex to be building firms like Seyfarth and uh, institutions like Public Discourse, so that there's an abundance of opportunity available, and that people in the pro-life camp can take bold positions without fear of not being able to get a job later. If there's just a lot of conservative institutions and pro-life institutions and faith-based institutions, then everyone's going to be able to land on their feet regardless. And that's a matter of just building up good group practice areas where you have a lawyer like Daniel who would be able to take on an associate given the right credentials, of course, but who has done work in the pro-life space, right? So just doing a good job for ourselves can help others get opportunities in the future in the institutions that we help bring about.
The only thing I will add to those excellent points is that the Litany of Humility, in my mind, is one of the most underrated prayers. And if there are any non-Catholics on this call, it is essentially a litany, a long list of requests, petitions to God, essentially saying, make everyone else important and make me small in many different ways. But I think that when it comes to decisions like the ones we're discussing here, it goes to that process of discernment that you've both touched on so beautifully, that it will help you situate yourself in a way that ensures you will be making a decision that is not motivated primarily by a desire for your own advancement or enlargement. So I would highly recommend to the Catholics who are familiar with the Litany of Humility, I stand with you in the need to repeat this prayer often. I say this for myself. And for the non-Catholics, it's interesting. It's something to look at, but the words are strangely comforting, particularly during trying times.
I don't know if I could think of a better way to end this conversation than to recommend the Litany of Humility. That's an awesome note to finish up on.